This might be a bit of a surprise to you all, but I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. I kinda can't get enough of listening to them when I'm either working on a project or when I'm just driving in my car or walking or out riding my bike. And what astonished me the most is that despite the large amount of audiobooks that are available on like audible.com or Amazon, there's quite a few books that, despite being quite good, have never actually had audiobooks made for them. And I realized, you know what? If no one else is going to do them, why not me? So this is a brand new type of segment that I'm doing. I'm going to be doing audiobook versions of different novels or nonfictions that have not had official audiobooks made for them. And I'm doing this because I want to draw attention to work that I think is really underrated, that needs more love given to it. I urge those who are watching this to actually check out the books that I talk about here on Apps and Audiobooks for yourself, to make your own conclusions, to draw your own opinions, and not just have me be the end-all for whether or not you like a book. And I'm going to start us off with a book by Jon Weiner, a book known as Historians in Trouble. Now, Jon Weiner's an American historian and journalist, and he's based out of Los Angeles. And the thing he's most well known for is a 25-year legal battle that ended with the release of the FBI's files on John Lennon. Yeah, in case you didn't know, the FBI was spying on John Lennon. Now, you might be wondering, seriously? They couldn't have been spying on John Lennon. That sounds kind of silly. But no, as he wrote in his own story, an undercover agent reported to J. Edgar Hoover that in this loft in the East Village there was a parrot, and whenever the conversation got heated, the parrot would shout, "Right on!" Now, it's kind of mildly amusing and interesting that there'd be a parrot that would shout, "Right on!" whenever a conversation was getting heated in the loft in the East Village that Lennon was hanging out in, but why did J. Edgar Hoover need to know that? And more importantly, why on earth would it be classified as confidential? It made no sense. And the only conclusion that you could basically draw was that they seriously thought that John Lennon was a type of anti-government radical who honestly would have encouraged, like, uprisings against the government. Then again, I'm not too surprised, because it's not like J. Edgar Hoover was, well, a nice guy who was sensitive to left-wing points. But the point being is that Jon Weiner is very strictly devoted to transparency in journalism and transparency in government. And because of that, I've decided to focus on this issue for the first audiobook that we're looking at. His book, Historians in Trouble. After all, we've got a huge debate going on in regards to the transparency of our governmental system in regards to the NSA. But did you know that in many ways, the smaller battles that we tend to overlook are the ones that are actually doing the most damage? I'll start at the beginning. Historians have been in the news a lot recently, and the news has not been good. Accusations of plagiarism, investigations of research fraud, and punishments for classroom misconduct have made headlines and in some cases even ended up in court. Media spectacles around scholarly scandals have become, as Ron Robin writes, a veritable cottage industry. Investigations of misconduct that in the past were confined to the profession, to academic senate committees and academic journals, are now being reported on page 1 and on the television news. What's new, he argues, is not the uncovering of wrongdoing, but rather the visibility of the charges and their dissemination as media events, performances staged and choreographed for mass-mediated consumption. But not all cases of wrongdoing by historians follow this scenario. While some of the charges of misconduct end up on page 1 and bring careers to an end, Other equally serious charges stay out of the media spotlight and bring little to no public sanction or punishment. So, why do some cases become media events while others remain within the confines of scholarly settings? The answer briefly is power, especially power wielded by groups outside the history profession. Historians targeted by powerful outside groups can face intense media scrutiny and severe sanctions for transgressions, whilst historians connected to powerful outside groups can be shielded from the media spotlight as well as the consequences of malfeasance. In some cases, they've even been rewarded. So this book investigates the relationships between power and media spectacles by examining a dozen key cases involving historians. The cases range across the political spectrum and represent a variety of charges of misconduct. They do not, I must emphasize, fall into a single pattern or point to a single conclusions. No. Some divide among left-right lines, others do not. The cases all illustrate, though, the many ways that power has been deployed in media spectacles to highlight the pitfalls of certain ways of writing history. They also illustrate the ways other cases have been neglected or ignored by the media. They show the different ways organized pressure groups have taken action against authors they regard as enemies. All of the cases shed light on the question of what happens to scholars charged with violating standards or rules, and in each case, I try to explain its particular outcome. The point here is not to condone misconduct or make excuses for errors. As H.E. Carr wrote in his classic book, What is History? Accuracy is a duty, not a virtue. The point is rather to explore why some instances are punished severely and others not at all. George W. Bush's nominations and appointments of historians to the National Council on the Humanities and the National Archives can provide illuminating cases of the uses of power in the face of charges of misconduct. Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who teaches history at Emory University, is a prominent critic of the contemporary feminist movement, and the author of the book Feminism is Not the Story of My Life. In 1995, she was sued for violating the civil rights of a female subordinate. In the lawsuit, the plaintiff, a middle-aged woman who had been a graduate student of and assistant to Fox Genovese, declared she'd been verbally abused and asked to perform duties that would not have been asked of a male subordinate, like picking up Fox Genovese's laundry and walking her dog. The court proceedings received considerable press coverage, and in 1996, before the case went to jury, Emory settled it for an undisclosed sum, reported to be $1 million. Despite Fox Genovese's heavily documented record of misconduct, Emory didn't conduct its own disciplinary proceedings, and in 2003, the Bush White House awarded Fox Genovese the National Humanities Medal. Alan Weinstein, in his book Perjury, did more to document the case against Alger Hiss than any other historian. But his documentation was challenged. Many key interviewees insisted they'd been misquoted. He steadfastly refused to make the documentation available to other historians as required by the American Historical Association guidelines. And as Michael Basales and others accused of misconduct did do that stuff, well, Weinstein faced no investigations or penalties like they did, and the AHA refused to take up the case against him. The mainstream media just ignored the charges, perhaps because Weinstein is on the popular side of an old debate. He defended the conventional wisdom about Alger Hiss. The people who have questioned the book's documentation did not have the power to get their case into the mainstream media, partly because the mainstream does not want to have to deal with the possibility that something is seriously wrong with the leading work documenting Hiss's guilt. Alan Weinstein stonewalled his critics for 25 years, and then in 2004, George W. Bush nominated him to be Archivist of the United States. Then there's a third case. Stefan Thernstrom teaches history at Harvard, and he's been a prominent critic of affirmative action, writing that blacks are to blame for many of their educational problems and suggesting that there is little racism in America today. A decade ago, some black students had complained that he had been, quote, racially insensitive, end quote, in his lectures. Thernstrom's outraged counterattack made him a hero in right-wing circles. His defense was actually featured in New York Magazine and in Dinesh D'Souza's 1991 book, Illiberal Education, which spent 9 weeks on the bestseller list. C. Vaughn Woodward, writing in the New York Review of Books, explained the Thernstrom case as an example of the attack on freedom, led by minorities. In fact, there had been no attack on freedom at Harvard. 3 black students had complained about a single lecture, a story reported in the campus paper. Thernstrom responded in the national media with the false claim that the Harvard administration had colluded with black students to make him a victim of McCarthyism on the left. And in 2002, the Bush White House nominated Thernstrom to the National Council on the Humanities. Now, the controversies around Fox Genovese, Weinstein, and Thernstrom all became media events, but their supporters succeeded, for the most part, in portraying the central figures not as miscreants guilty of misconduct, but rather as innocent victims of political correctness. All were honored for standing up to the left, and rewarded with White House nominations to distinguished positions. In each of the cases, the crucial issue was who had the power to frame the media spectacle. While these historians' careers advanced despite charges of misconduct, others faced very different outcomes. The most obvious contrast is found in the media spectacle around Michael Basales, the Emory historian who wrote about the origins of gun culture in America. He faced a vociferous campaign by gun rights groups, which prompted debate in scholarly journals and then an investigation by distinguished historians. In the end, he resigned a tenured position, even though the Emory Review panel found evidence of fraud only on one table that was referred to only a few times in a 400-page book. Basales made a strong case that he was guilty of error, not fraud, and the episode demonstrated the power of an organized political group on the right to target a historian they identified as an enemy, and raises the question of the appropriate sanction for error. Mike Davis provides a second example of a media spectacle around a historian targeted by the right for his politics. Davis, a leading Marxist historian, won a MacArthur Genius Grant and an appointment as a Getty Institute scholar for his book on Los Angeles, called City of Quartz, after which a Malibu realtor launched a campaign in 1999 against him, charging that his footnotes in a new book, Ecology of Fear, were fraudulent. The charges mushroomed and were featured in the New York Times, The Economist, even on page 1 of the Los Angeles Times. Neither UCLA nor USC would hire him, and he ended up leaving Los Angeles for a job at SUNY Stony Brook. Evidently, the search committee and administration at Stony Brook concluded that the errors in his footnotes were minor, and that he met the requirement for an appointment to a tenured position there. The recent stories of Basales and Mike Davis were reminiscent in some ways of the David Abraham case of the mid-'80s, when an assistant professor coming up for tenure at Princeton faced attack by a politically conservative senior Yale historian whose work he had challenged. The issue, as presented by the media, was errors in Abraham's account of German business backing for Hitler. Abraham had the support of many leading historians, but the Abraham case was featured on page 1 of the New York Times, and within a year, he was forced out of the position. These cases suggest that the right has much more power than the left to define the meaning and significance of charges of misconduct for the public. But not all recent charges of scholarly misconduct became media spectacles, and ended up on page 1 of the New York Times. Oh no. The third section of this book examines cases where the charges of misconduct were significant, and where the evidence was strong. But nevertheless, the cases were greeted with indifference by the media. John Lott's research on guns has played a key role in leading states and cities to pass laws that permit people to carry concealed firearms. Lott argued that brandishing guns without firing them was sufficient to deter criminals in almost all cases, but his claim to have done survey research on the issue was shown to be fraudulent. Nevertheless, Lott received virtually no media attention for this fraud and paid no penalties. His publisher, the University of Chicago Press, has kept the fraudulent claims in the new edition of the book, and Lott continues to publish op-eds in leading venues, and the brandishing laws he helped pass remain in force. Edward A. Pearson's 1999 book on the Denmark-Vesey slave rebellion was shown to contain massive errors of transcription and, more seriously, a deeply erroneous description of the document he transcribed. It was not, as Edward Pearson had said, a verbatim trial transcript at all. It was a retrospective summary of testimony for the prosecution, revised by persons unknown. This misunderstanding, in the view of many, undermined the author's entire thesis, and suggested that Denmark-Vesey was an innocent man framed by the white power structure rather than the leader of a slave rebellion. The book's publisher withdrew it from publication, but no other disciplinary action was taken against Pearson. In fact, at Franklin and Marshall College, where he teaches, the administration reviewed his case and decided no punishment by the school was appropriate. He remains chair of the history department at Franklin and Marshall. So this raises the question, why do some charges of misconduct become media spectacles with dramatic consequences for the central figures, while others do not? The explanation seems to lie in power, or lack thereof, of interested constituencies. In the case of Pearson, there was just nobody interested in or outside the profession arguing that a key slave rebellion should be removed from the historical record. And the Lott case illustrates the way the gun lobby has immensely more power than the gun control lobby. But finally, I want to consider media spectacles that were not framed around a left-to-right confrontation, such as the Dino Sinel case, one of the first in which sexual abuse by a Catholic priest became known in 1993, and still one of the best documented. After Dino was appointed Distinguished Professor of Italian-American Immigration History at the City University of New York, the media discovered he'd been defrocked as a priest several years earlier because he'd been having sex with a number of teenage boys. Nevertheless, the American Federation of Teachers, which represented Sinel, argued he should not be fired because he had tenure, and as a result it took years to dismiss him from the university. Joseph Ellis, the best-selling and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, made page 1 in 2001 for lying to his class at Mount Holyoke, telling students he'd fought in Vietnam. Now, the school's punishment was strong and appropriate, but the argument made in the media was that lying to his students in class is not as serious as lying to the readers in print, and thus he was probably rehabilitated by the New York Times and the New Yorker. Plagiarism, of course, provides the simplest case of scholarly misconduct, and it's the easiest to explain to the public. The well-known cases of plagiarism by the late Stephen Ambrose and by Doris Kearns Goodwin have become major media spectacles. They're the easiest cases to educate because the evidence is clear-cut, but as Thomas Mellon showed in his 1989 book on the topic, even some of the most blatant cases receive the least attention and the lightest punishment. Here, the size of the spectacle seems to depend on the celebrity of the accused, rather than the seriousness of the offense. And so my concluding chapter addresses some obvious questions. Is some kind of stricter oversight of the history profession necessary? And if so, who should exercise it? Charges of misconduct that become media spectacles have ended careers only when powerful groups outside the profession organize campaigns that demand punishment. And typically, the right, rather than the left, has organized and succeeded with such campaigns. Could the history profession itself counter the power of these organized interest groups? The American Historical Association recently abandoned its procedures for addressing charges of plagiarism and professional misconduct, so that gives the media and the forces that shape them even more power to define the issues and educate scholarly controversies, to honor scholars who advance their partisan political agendas, and punish those who would challenge those agendas.